Welcome to this Bible study where we're going to be looking at the story of Moses and the Exodus. Now this is a really important story in the Old Testament. In fact, it supersedes the story of Abraham. In the story of the Exodus, really everything is laid down which will be looked back at by people like the prophets, because the people of Israel break this covenant made with God during the Exodus, and the prophets keep on calling them back to obedience to the covenant with God, and they talk of the ills that the people of Israel suffer as a judgment because they're not keeping their side of the bargain. The story of Moses begins with the people of Israel under enormous deprivation in Egypt, where they have become slaves. And the Egyptians are so frightened of the growing number of the Israelites that the Pharaoh tells mothers, when they give birth to a boy child, to throw the child into the river. And so Moses is saved by a very clever mother and sister. She does throw him into the river, but he is in a basket that floats, and is providentially saved by none other than the Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts him but hands him back to his own mother to operate as a nurse. And the other thing that prepares him for what's going to be his destiny in life is that he is educated in Egyptian ways. So he gets a really good education. However, despite the fact that Moses has been brought up to all intents and purposes as an Egyptian, he does not forget his own people, and he possesses a sense of the fact that they are being treated very cruelly and in an unjust way. And he boils over when he sees the taskmasters beating one of the Israelite slaves, and in fact he murders him. And he hides the body, but the next day when he finds two Israelites fighting and tries to intervene, they have clearly seen what he's done, and so he takes flight and he rushes off away from Egypt to get away from what would be ultimately death for murder. But just as God providentially saved him and also made sure that he got a good education, God's hand is on him, even though he's perhaps at his lowest ebb, looking after sheep in the desert. And we come to this famous story about the burning bush, the bush that is on fire but is not consumed. And he turns aside and God speaks to him. But God tells him to do what would apparently be impossible, to go back to Egypt for a start, which would be pretty dangerous, but to do what he actually wanted to do in the first place, but to do it rather differently. He's called to go back and to liberate, under God, the people of Israel. Now, of course, in the light of his past experience, he's not keen. But also he's overwhelmed at this point in his life with his own inadequacies. He says to God, well, I can't talk really in public, and so on. There's excuse after excuse. But God is not having any of it, and provides ways in which Moses can go back and can fulfill what is his God-given destiny. So the way in which the people of Israel are led out from Egypt and from slavery with Moses, as it were, at the head of the procession, isn't through him, as it were, declaring war on Pharaoh. God does that. And in the story there are all these plagues until eventually, and it takes a very long while, Pharaoh's had enough. And so he lets the people go, but he then changes his mind and sends chariots and soldiers after them. But there is then the miraculous crossing of the Sea of Reeds, where the Israelites get through in dry land, and then the waters come back and consume the Egyptian army. So once they're out in the desert and away from slavery in Egypt, Moses' task really is to make the children of Israel a nation under God. And this is almost an impossible task as well, because they keep on moaning and groaning about how rough it is being out in the desert, and they were better off as slaves, and so on and so on. But the main thrust of this part of the story is Moses becomes a lawgiver. He gives them the laws that if they keep them, then God will be with them and bring them to their desired end. Now, what's interesting about the law is that it mostly deals with external behaviour. There's one exception to this, which is the 10th commandment in the 10 commandments, and that deals with covetousness, which is an internal attitude. But the rest of it really is all about how you deal with one another under God. So you can say that the Exodus is a story about the kingdom of God as an external kingdom, a political kingdom, and a geographical kingdom. Because salvation comes about by being a member of this community. It's in no way individualistic. Now, I'd like to suggest that the Exodus story is an archetypal story of liberation. And of course it's been adopted as such by many causes throughout history, where people who felt in one way disenfranchised or enslaved have looked at this biblical story and seen it as a pattern which can help them in their own struggles for liberation. So the journey of the people of Israel from slavery to inheriting the promised land is a story that is very applicable to many people right down to today. So what conclusions can we come to when we look at the story of Moses and the Exodus? Well, the conclusion I would come to is that historically, to try and make a godly nation always seems to fail. It does in the story of the Exodus and the subsequent Jewish history, where the people of Israel are forever breaking the covenant and incurring the wrath of God. But historically, people that have looked to this story as their inspiration have also failed. One can look at the Reformation period, where the Anabaptists of Munster tried to make their city into a city of the godly. They ended up by being attacked both by mainline Protestants and by Catholics, and the whole thing's collapsed. In the English Civil War, the Puritans tried to make England a nation which was godly, but it failed because various groups couldn't decide or agree amongst themselves what that would look like. And so we can see that it may be a great thing to aim at, but in some ways it never works. But we can see this story on another level. It's Our story is a story of an internal journey, and you can look at the story of Moses and the Exodus in that way. We don't go to a geographical place, but we do go to, as it were, a promised land within us through Christ. And when we come to the story of Jesus, we'll see how he internalises these things. And so his kingdom isn't a political kingdom or a geographical kingdom, but it is a kingdom of liberation, which is an internal kingdom.